So without further ado, let me invite our first keynote speaker. Melanie Keane unfortunately couldn't make it, so she sends her regrets, and I would like to invite our US keynote speaker to introduce the subject through her research on museums and trust. Susie Wilkening, she's principal and founder of the Wilkening Consulting, and will give a presentation on museums in a changing world. Audiences, trends, impact, trust. So please, Susie.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so much to the Benaki Museum, the British Council, and the US Embassy for supporting this wonderful conference. A few weeks ago, there was an election in the United States. It was closely fought. The results were also very close. And it really shows us the divides that we have in the United States, those political divides around our values and what we want for our future to hold. Museums are not immune from those divides. And so we're going to be looking at how audience research in the United States that we field in partnership with the American Alliance of Museums helps us understand how those values come into those museum experiences and what it means for us as museums moving forward. We're going to take a high-level view of it today, and then tomorrow in the master class, we're going to go back to the basics and talk about methodology, how we do audience research, and give you some more tactics and strategies for dealing with some of these issues that we're all facing. But I wanted to start us off with this quote. This is from an individual who visits museums frequently in response to some of the research that we put out in the field. And they said, "Museum experiences have challenged me to honor the complexity of experience, to acknowledge that context, perspective dramatically shapes understanding, and that we are all more similar than different. I would love to see museums facilitate dialogue and experiences that foster empathy and relatedness with the other. Social media echo chambers and political tribalism desperately needs a counterpoint, where seeking to understand the other is prioritized and celebrated." Every day, millions of people engage with museums and museum content. And we have a lot of big questions about that. Why do they choose to spend their time visiting museums? What impact have museums had that makes so many value them? And we're going to explore those tomorrow. But today, we're going to look at why do they trust what museums share and what threatens that trust. So that audience research that we field every year is helping to answer some of those questions and gain that better understanding of how those visitor values and attitudes affect those museum experiences. And our future is fairly uncertain, and we need to understand those values to kind of think about that future. Much of what I'm going to share today is actually positive, and it's hopeful. But those challenges do appear to be growing. So we're going to look at conflicting worldviews and polarization, trust and skepticism, and give you some tools to help. So here's the good news, and we're going to start with some really great news. Most people want museums to do really good, hard work that benefits us all individually, that benefits our families, that benefits our communities, and our society. So I'm going to give you some examples from our research. So first, just a 20-second methodology. When we refer to frequent museum goers, these are people who go to museums fairly frequently, so much that they are on a communications list. They are getting emails from a museum. They might be following a museum on social media. They were invited to take a survey by one of those museums. They took time to do so. So think of those as really the people who love museums and champion them and visit them often. We also field broader population sampling, what we call demographically representative sampling of US adults around the country. And that's going to include people who visit museums quite a bit, more casually, maybe once or twice a year, those who maybe go every few years, and those who do not visit at all. And again, it's demographically representative. So that's what those two categories are. Okay, so that said, most people, virtually everyone, agrees that museums are places that support health and well-being, that museums deepen knowledge, are places that cultivate curiosity, that make visitors feel more connected to others, that museums should be active participants in our civil society, that museums all help us feel a greater connection to humanity. And yes, most people want museums to share inclusive content. So most people support the work of museums to share science, to build healthy communities, to connect us together, and to explore our shared history. What's stopping us? And that's a segment of the population that we've been increasingly calling the resistant. Those who are resisting many of the ideas and ideals that we value and want to put forward in museums. There are 3 areas of content that they really strongly resist, and 2 outcomes that we've discovered that they also tend to resist. And that's around content areas around climate change and climate action, inclusive content, and content around our civil society and civics. The outcomes that they are strongly resisting are cultivating a connection to humanity and the cultivation of hope for the future. And if you look at these numbers, you can see it's about 1 in 5 people who are really strongly resisting these ideas and ideals. So we put them into that more resistant segment. And if they resist one of them, they usually resist the others as well. So it tends to be a pretty tight group. On the other hand, about 3 out of 5 people are much more open to these topics. They celebrate these topics and these outcomes. They think they're fantastic. And about 1 in 5 fall more in the middle. They're open to them, but maybe have some hesitation, a little ambivalence. And so we end up with this kind of, these percentages here. Now, 20% of the population is far from a majority. But 20% seems to be that point at which like-minded people have an easier time finding one another. And when they find one another, they can validate each other's perspectives and develop a shared language around resisting these topics and these ideas. And then they use that shared identity-based community that they've developed to promote those ideas more broadly, especially on social media, but capturing even more attention from the broader public. And when they vote, and in the United States, they vote in what are called primaries to determine who those final candidates are going to be. So in those primaries, they develop significant political leverage because they work really hard to get a certain candidate onto that final ballot, and then to push that candidate forward and as that winning candidate as well. So they have a lot of political leverage. Now, on many of these topics, because our society is moving forward on so many of them, they feel very defensive. And so their responses when they see this kind of content in museums tends to be really emotional, and it tends to be very vocal and volatile. They use really intense language and have this very strong response. They also use their political leverage to shut down content that they don't like, whether it's in schools and libraries, which is happening increasingly in the United States, with teachers being told what they can and cannot teach in some places, with libraries having to pull books out of them because parents are concerned about their children seeing them, and increasingly in museums as well. So they're using that political leverage really effectively. So what will help? As practitioners working in this field, if we accuse them of being this way, if we finger point, if we demonize those who resist, it's actually counterproductive. It actually makes things worse. So what we really try to do is go back and to understand those values that they have, those attitudes, why they are resisting those things in particular. One of the things we'd spend a lot of time doing is looking at language and what language people are using when they talk about these topics. The resistant people give different reasons for resisting those kinds of content, but we have discovered that they tend to view the world as one of scarce resources, that if you do this one thing, you can't do this other thing. So everything results in a trade-off. They don't look at it as you can do both. And so when everything is a zero-sum game, as we say in English, and it's got that trade-off, then they get more afraid. Because at whose expense are those resources, whether those resources are financial or resources of attention, such as the attention a museum pays to a topic, or resources of identity, if they are perceived to be reallocated at whose expense, and they're worried it's at their expense. And that really brings us to the heart of the issue, which is fear. The fears expressed by these resistant people who don't like this type of content are really strong. They're palpable, so defensive, so emotional. And we've found 6 areas where they tend to come out. Fears for society, fears for the future, fears for their country. Make America Great Again is a great example of that. Fears for the truth, fears for themselves, and fears for their values. And in particular, what we also hear a lot of is the fear of their ability to transmit their values generationally to their children and their grandchildren, which is a lot of the fears that are manifesting themselves with book bans in the United States. So we have these really huge emotional responses. And they feel that this content, the content that so many museums want to share, they feel it does harm. And so they're going to try really hard to shut it down. And they use different defense mechanisms to do that, including all of these, which we're not going to go through. But this is from skepticalscience.com. I strongly encourage you to take a look at that website. But there are just so many different ways they try to use to shut down content that they don't like. But there's 3 in particular that we see a lot of. One is what we call coded language. It's a phrase that might sound good at first, and then you go, wait a minute, what are they really trying to say? So they'll say things like, just give me the facts and I'll make up my own mind. Or they'll say, talk about the important history, talk about the significant stories, show the real art. All of these are tools, language tools that they use to try to privilege a white heteronormative narrative for the most part. False choices, those are those perceived trade-offs that don't really exist. Or the both sides fallacy or fake debate, which attempts to elevate an erroneous version of the past, or maybe pseudoscience, to being equal to what the evidence actually tells us. And that is, of course, very dangerous. And then diversionary tactics, logical fallacies, quote mining, or slothful induction, or simply just saying, that is not your job. And when they do that, what they're trying to do is to change your attention so that you're more defensive, so that you stop doing what they don't like, so trying to divert you from that topic. Fundamentally, this is a trust issue, though. Do they trust the content being shared? Do they trust the purpose of the institution? Do they trust the people working at the institution? And do they trust that their interests, their well-being, are also valued as human beings? So let's talk quickly about trust. The good news is that in the United States, trust in museums has proven to be rather resilient. And so when we fielded a survey of US adults across the country back in 2021 with the American Alliance of Museums, we asked, how trustworthy do you find all these different things? Friends and family win, but number 2 is museums at the average of 6.4. And you can see how everything else kind of falls out. We're going to be going back into the field in February with this exact same line of inquiry to have an update. This past winter, though, we did find among US adults that 92% think that museums are nonpartisan providers of educational content. So why are museums generally trusted? When we ask people about that, what they generally tell us is that museums are perceived as research-oriented and fact-based, that art, objects, artifacts, and specimens are perceived to be inherently trustworthy. They are their own messengers of the past, their own messengers of art or science. Museums are perceived as nonpartisan and neutral. Note that I have neutral in quotation marks because no one agrees on what neutral means. And that history itself is inherently trustworthy because it's in the past, therefore it cannot be changed, and therefore it is only facts and therefore, again, neutral. This is a responsibility and a challenge for all of this because we make choices about what art to share, whose stories to tell, and what evidence to consider. Those more open people, the majority of people, generally have really high levels of trust in museums. And additionally, and this is what's so interesting, as museums have become more inclusive, those who were excluded in the past appear to be cautiously increasing their trust in museums, and that's really positive and wonderful. But at the same time, more resistant people feel these changes are coming at their expense and that museums are becoming political actors, and that's the word they bring up immediately when they get in that defensive mode. Stop being political is what they'll say. So this politicization of content can quickly bring controversy to a museum. But we're not divorced from our civil society. We don't set ourselves aside from that, including we can't divorce ourselves from that partisanship happening on so many topics that museums share. We are not immune from these pressures. We cannot contort ourselves in ways to avoid polarizing topics, because at this point, at least in the US, almost everything is polarizing. So there are some tools to help. I'm going to be sharing more about them tomorrow, but I just want to make sure everyone has a chance to know what they are. Those tools can help you think through how you work with broader audiences, including those more resistant worldviews. One is a primer of audiences and inclusion. It's a booklet that's a free PDF download from the American Alliance of Museums website. It gives you some great tools for working with various audiences. Developing and publicizing your shared value statements. What are those shared values that we do share with our community? How do we build based on those shared values? And then practicing what's called disinformation inoculation as a way of getting ahead of controversy before it even happens so you can then be more effective in your work. And so to wrap things up, some final thoughts. In the United States, at least, museums are expecting things to become trickier over the coming years. We continue to experience really interesting times. The response to the 2024 election, and what that's going to mean for museums over the next 4 years. The upcoming commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. And relentless extreme weather events. No one's immune from extreme weather events, but around the globe, there's also the rise of far-right political movements, economic uncertainty, increasing conflict in the Middle East, disagreement with how we address asylum and humanitarian relief, and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. But we do want you to remember, most people do really support museums and the good, hard work that benefits us all individually, our families, our communities, and our society. And they support our work to explore art, cultures, history, science, build healthy communities, connect us to one another and our shared humanity on this planet, and to support our democracies. So I'm going to leave you with one last quote. It is a privilege, again, this is from a museum goer. It is a privilege to have access to any museum of any kind. They are a reflection of history and the humanities. Communities benefit from the enrichment provided by museums, and we would all be worse off without them. Museums are a mirror of ourselves. We can look into the past or imagine the future thanks to museums. And thanks to all of you who do this work every day.
Oh, thank you, Susie. It's quite troubling to think of the controversy even of resistance and then trying to be even more impactful in a society when at the end of the day maybe people don't want you to always. Do we have any questions from the people who are here? I see a hand here in the front. Name and affiliation, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Stefanos Hirovis. I'm with the European Network of Science Centers and Museums. Two things. First of all, the question of trust. You have a number of very interesting quotes from people who seem to be converted to, and we tend to. I mean, I'm not indicating that it's a bubble, but we tend to get, let's say, to our best customers. Mm-hmm. Do you have some data or information or strategies concerning underserved audiences, the type of audiences that is quite tricky to find out? And I'm not talking about audiences that are convinced in the extreme part of the societies, but those that we usually are difficult to locate, and we would like to engage with and share their stories and build these type of connections.
So one of the things that we do when we field this research every year is we go into what we call broader population sampling, and that's where we go to find a demographically representative sample of US adults around the country and ask them their thoughts. And so when we do that, we are making sure that that sample is representative across race and ethnicity, across educational attainment, across different ages. And so when we look at those samples and when we gather that data, what we do tend to find is that most people love having museums in their community. Most people think very positively of museums. But some of them are saying these museums, we love that we have them in our community, but they're just not places that I go to regularly because they have other commitments. So it could be that they are just extremely busy as a family. But it also could be when we think about the pressures on individual lives. What are those barriers? Financial is certainly one, but it's also barriers of time or energy or knowing how to navigate those systems and what's out there for them. And so we think about, if someone is working a job that requires a lot of physical labor and they come home at the end of the day and they're really exhausted, and their child says, I want to go get to the library and get some books, and the library's free, and it's 2 blocks away. That barrier of exhaustion still may be enough to keep them from going to the library, so they're also going to keep them from going to the Natural History Museum to see butterflies. So we have to think about all of those barriers. So they still tend to think very positively of museums, but fitting them into their lives gets to be extremely difficult.
Thank you. And I have one question online.
Yes.
Which says that you mentioned this toolkit on how to deal with language and polarization. Mm-hmm. Could you expand on this?
Sure. So there are a number of resources that are available online through the American Alliance of Museums website. If you go to, it's aam-us.org, and search for the Inclusion Primer, you'll find it's a PDF, and it talks a lot about dealing with different people's values and attitudes, but also gives you a 10-step guide to sharing more inclusive content specifically with the public. The first one is to think about your own biases as you go into this work as well, because we are human beings with our own biases too, and thinking about how that might affect how we're sharing what we're sharing. So you can look for that. It's really easy to find. And then also on the Wilkening Consulting website, all of the research that we do on behalf of museums across the country, we work with about 500 different museums across the country every year. We also provide as infographic data stories. So if you like infographics, you will have a great time searching our website. And there are lots of tools there as well, especially if you look under politics, polarization, I think civics, I forget what the topics are on the website. But if you look under some of those topics, you can certainly find a number of infographic data stories that shares more of the research, but also shares some tactics and tricks for working with different audiences and different values.
Thank you. We'll take one more question over there.
Yeah, Bartosz Frąckowiak from 4CF and Warsaw Biennial Foundation from Warsaw. And I've got one question and comment regarding the resistance and how you described how it is constructed as a kind of bottom-up process that is leveraged on certain level by, like, you know, political powers. But I think that it's also the opposite, that it's also top-down. So it's intentionally politically engineered quite often. And for instance, in the context of, you know, Eastern Europe and Poland, for instance, we could observe how anti-refugee discourse was used to mobilize electorate. So it was something that was completely engineered, also with, you know, algorithmically fueled disinformation. So creating on purpose disinformation by political powers, mostly right-wing politicians, but not only, because now we can see this shift into more liberal central stage, but they use exactly the same tools. So I'm thinking that it's both. It's top-down and bottom-up process. So
Definitely, I definitely agree with you, and I think what often happens is, from that top-down perspective, they're seeing this language of this resistance, and they feed into it, and it ends up into this like symbiotic relationship where they're going, at the bottom-up grassroots is influencing the top, and the top is influencing the grassroots, and it goes back and forth, back and forth. But for sure, in the United States, there is a lot of top-down influence as well, because what that shared language, if we look at the shared language that we see and written in comments about museum content, we can then also go to certain media outlets and hear the exact same language being given over the television, for example, by newscasters on certain outlets. And you're just like, it's getting that validation of language going back and forth, back and forth. Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to thank a big thank you to Susie.
A pleasure.
For all the information. You'll have the opportunity to see her again later, whoever wants to ask more questions.